Let's head now to our next speaker, Pia Pohatu, Ngāti Porou Hikurangi Enterprises. Nei tāna kaupapa kōrero, she'll be talking about Māori land decision making for native forest regeneration. Nō reira, Pia, kei a koe te wā.
Tēnā tātou katoa I whakarauika I rungi I te kaupapa o te rā nei. I roto I ngā tini āhuatanga o te wā, ka tika me mihi kia rātou kua mene atu ki te pō, haere o ki atu. Huri no kia tātou te hunga ora tēnā tātou. Ko te manako, kei te noho haumaru tātou, I ro kāinga, I ro whānau, I tēnei wā. Ngā mihi o te wā kia koutou katoa. Ko tokatea, ko kōkai o ku maunga, ko te whānau rākairoa, ko te aitanga mate o ku hapu, ko te kiakia me wharepunga o ku marae, ko mangaoraka me parika rangaranga o ku wā kāinga, ko kōpuro te koawa. Tēnā koutou. So kia ora everyone, my name is Pia Pohatu. I'm from Ruatoria. And amongst other things, I've been involved in kaupapa taiao research for 20-something years back home here. And I've been asked today to share a project that Hikurangi Enterprises and Motu Research partnered in between 2017 and 2020. And it's the name of the project is called Testing the NZ ETS for Regenerating Native Forestry on Māori land. And the additional organisation involved in that was Victoria University. So in that research kaupapa, we worked with decision makers from 14 Māori land blocks. The land entity types covered Māori incorporations, ahu whenua trusts, Māori land administered by Te Timu Paeroa, as well as family trusts and one post-settlement governance entity. So that was in Te Tairāwhiti, but the majority of them were are land blocks within the Waiapu catchment. And probably a key requisite for them being involved with us and vice versa was that they had an aspiration for native forestry. That was key in us linking up in our forest, in this research. So essentially the project wanted to follow and get insights into their decision-making journey. And to simplify it, we chose these 4 points. Their decision for establishing native forestry, and establishing included both regenerating native forestry as well as new planting of native forestry. The second point was whether they would access grants or financial support to establish that native forestry. So in that time frame, ECFP was just starting to close out, and 1BT, 1 billion trees, those were the available grants at the time. Then the third decision-making point was the decision to take that native forestry, or to seek eligibility and registration in the ETS for that native forestry. And then the last point would be their considerations around trading the NZUs generated from the ETS. So simplified, it's 4 key points in that decision-making journey. But the research soon found out that the process is actually very complex, and there's layers of complexity. So Māori land governance is complex. Trying to establish native forestry is complex, whether you're putting in new plantings or allowing regenerated areas to stay in native forestry. And then the ETS itself, determining eligibility, registering, and is complex again. So there were multiple layers of complexity for different reasons, and it shows in this table here, actually only one of our 14 land blocks had an experience of trading NZUs. 3 of the land blocks were registered in the ETS, but actually they were already registered before, so they weren't registered in the lifetime of our research project. And of the balance, the other 11, by the time we finished the research project, only 2 had made the decision to enter into the NZ ETS. And just as we were closing, there were challenges or additional considerations, so they hadn't actually signed up to the ETS at the time that our research project closed off. So that's a hint at the complexity that Māori landowners and Māori land decision makers have to consider in trying to move through this process. So this is a roadmap we developed to try and capture that complexity. We developed this roadmap approach. You could say this actually follows one of our land blocks. And you can see that at each phase, so we had 4 phases back up there on this decision-making journey. There's actually a phase before that, and we called it pre-decision, and that was around working with the landowners to work out what we called their starting lines. So what state was their governance at, what were their current land uses, what was their financial situation. And we had to get them to consider those things, work out what they weren't happy with, and why a decision or an aspiration for native forestry, how that would address those challenges or concerns, and set them up to connect to their whenua in the ways that they wanted to. So that got us to this, the next section there is around aspirations, opportunities, and preferred land use, and that ties in closely with getting to make the decision for native forestry. Essentially, everyone that we scoped before when we started the project, probably only 25% of them actually had an aspiration for native forestry. So we might have scoped about 60 land blocks, and then invited another 15 to participate, and then we've ended up with the blocks that we've got participating. So I'm not necessarily saying the aspiration for native forestry isn't there, but it does signal there's a whole host of other considerations you have to take into consideration before your land and the collective ownership that you have to make decisions for gets on board with that same aspiration. Most of the land blocks showed that they were quite disconnected from their whenua in terms of the decision making, and effectively what they were wanting was to reconnect, to be better connected, and to have the land used in a way that they valued it. So, in this particular block, it was leased out for beef farming by another incorporation who, whakapapa-wise, they all had a close connection to. but actually they wanted a place for papakainga and for rongoa and to spend time on the whenua, and native, the aspiration for native forestry seemed to match that better than receiving lease income. So the project, research-wise, we did interviews. We also set up workshops and convened wānanga to help us all. It wasn't just the landowners benefiting, it was all of us involved, work through the challenges. It certainly isn't a linear process. So then we got to those wanting to go into native forestry. The key challenges there were that all the trustees were on the same page around that aspiration, and that actually business cases were needed, especially for new plantings. What was your planting plan? What was your pest control plan? Did you have fencing up? What finance was going to be required? We were quite well into the research before we could get info around the cost of establishing native forest. So the initial cost that we found out was that it would cost $15,000 per hectare to establish native forest. Greater amounts have also been referenced as well, and that takes us to accessing funding. At best, 1BT could provide around $4,000 per hectare, and it was kind of misleading that information about the grants and the subsidies at $4,000 a hectare came out before the true cost of establishing native forests. So that kind of skewed, I think is the best word to use, that skewed, what it would really take to establish native forestry, and the liability tied to those funding contracts was concerning, especially where, in terms of the ECFP, the contract liability went for 15 years and 1BT was 10 years. So if you got the subsidy, you put in the plants, and then for some reason you couldn't manage pest control, or that planting was damaged, the landowner held that liability for 10 and 15 years. In the case of land blocks administered by Te Tumu Paeroa were very uncomfortable with the potential of leaving landowners with liability. So if landowners chose to take their whenua out of Te Tumu Paeroa and these contracts had been entered into, the liability rested with landowners. It wasn't so much a problem if your land was accessible by State Highway 35 or our country roads, but often our blocks are very isolated, the terrain is very rugged, and while you might meet eligibility for the funding, managing that contract liability was something else. And they all confirmed that if they were to get a third party to establish that forest, the grant, at best, the grant dented about 30% of the actual cost to establish and manage that forest. So, those were key learnings, I think, that our landowners and our land decision makers needed to know early on in the process, in terms of moving towards establishing native forestry. In the latter phases, like those that actually got to the point of making a decision for the NZETS, that's when we really got to understand the nitty-gritty steps you need to take when you're registering, and which are, well, they are what they are. They're quite stringent. At a policy level and at an administration level, consultants were expressed their concerns with the subject nature of how the process is interpreted. So they advised us they'd use the same mappers, they'd follow the same process, they provide the same info, and one application will get through and another wouldn't. That's a hint at the sort of subjectivity depending on who was administering the application to join ETS. The key point, though, that we wanted this research to get across to the decision makers, the landowner decision makers, is that they had to understand the opportunities and challenges of the ETS. For all of the land blocks, the ETS was never a driver in their aspiration for native forestry. It would be bonus income if it worked out that way. Determining eligibility, if you were a mapper and you had that skills, it would be straightforward. But actually trying to get that info, most landowners would want to seek feasibility funding to get that eligibility worked out. For a lot of our blocks, especially for me living here in Whānau Rākairo and Te Aitangamate, we aren't eligible. Our lands were already back in Kānuka and Mānuka at the 1990 cut-off. So while we have a lot of land and a lot of land in regenerating bush, it's ineligible for NZETS. One of the land blocks I'm on, we've got 1,200 hectares. Not even 100 hectares of that would be eligible. So there's, you're sort of getting down to tin tacks right about now. I think the key thing, though, is to understand, for those who do go through, to understand the liabilities of being in the NZETS, and that you communicate that really well with your landowners. Getting money for carbon, this thing in the air, is quite hard to communicate, especially with our older generations. And and it's permanent. Once you sign up and put your land in the ETS, it's permanent. It's not a 25-year thing like Ngā Whenua Rāhui covenants. The next generation can't change your minds, because your decisions, because there's a liability there to repay the income you've received from the NZUs you've traded. So those kinds of discussions and kōrero need to be done in a real plain language way, so that your landowners are fully on board with the decisions that you're making, and that has to then become a taonga tuku, or you've got to transfer that intergenerationally, so that any decision to overturn lands put into the ETS are not there's liability attached with them. And then the last aspect of that decision point is around trading. A lot of the land blocks had whakaaro around who they might want to trade to, what sort of business those companies were, and who they might trade with, and the benefits really from the relationships. So throughout all of this, relationships are key. Landowner relationships to their whenua, relationships in making decisions with other third parties or organisations or agencies, and that certainly carries through in terms of trading units. We're wanting to build relationships all the time. So a key part of this was the governance capability across the land blocks, or in each land block. And that's in order to make decisions in a timely manner. Once you start getting into applying for grants and, you know, investing resources into establishing native forests and getting to the ETS process, there's sort of time frames involved, there's timeliness to making decisions, the changes in banks, you know, the extra requirements where all signatories have to be on board to ensure you've got a functioning bank account. It could be as simple as that. A key barrier that we heard about that didn't actually relate to any of our blocks was trustees to sign up to the ETS. Trustees' identification, birth certificate, passport, driver's license actually needed to be in the name of the trustee and how they were registered with the Māori Land Court. I'm sure we've all got whānau who the name we know them by is not the name on their birth certificate. All of things like that, you won't get through the ETS process. So there's a need to really ensure that your governance entity is able to meet the requirements of those processes. And if you're diversifying, so if you're going from current land use that has economic benefit at least, there are extra considerations, and that's mainly around persuading or getting your land ownership onto the same page as you around that's the direction to take, or that's one of the land uses that you, one of multiple land uses that you all agree and endorse your whenua is a part of. So just to summarise there, 3 of the 14 blocks were registered with the ETS, but they actually did that beforehand. A further 2 made the decision for the ETS, but were still to administer that. Aspects of that process, including working out eligibility, registering in the ETS, filing emissions. Most people use consultants to do that, and then actually trading the NZUs where the income comes back from, you know, a decision that started way over there. Now you're getting to generate some income off the decision to go into the ETS. So sort of in conclusion, some summary points. Landowner motivations for getting into forestry. All of the blocks are looking towards an integrated land use model that was more in tune with kaitiakitanga and gaining multiple benefits, not just economic. And the key challenges around that have been covered around governance, readiness, and the added complexity of diversifying your land use. Accessing afforestation funding programs. Again, the landowner motivations were just the cost, just the capital investment required up front. The ongoing challenges relate to that liability that I spoke of before, managing that contract over 10 to 15 years, and managing pest control and the success of the health of that native forestry that you established. For landowners who were still very connected with their whenua and had that expertise, whether it was hunting or goat culling or deer hunting, fencing and planting, it is possible to do this. Partly managed on a koha basis, as well as your grant funding supporting the material costs or the plant costs. And a key point to that the project promoted was that in a forestation support program continue beyond 1BT. As of today, I don't know that 1BT hasn't been extended, and I haven't seen an afforestation support program as yet, unless you sort of tied it up into something else like fencing waterways type kaupapa. Landowner motivations to get into the NZETS is just to diversify revenue from something that they wanted anyway. And the challenges, you need experts to help you navigate the process. You need to understand the ETS parts of your whenua, integrated into the your broader plans for your whenua, and effectively communicating with your landowners, and that's treat it as a taonga tukuho. It has to be translated through the generations because it is a very permanent and enduring decision. And then trading NZUs, landowners wanted to realise that income with the relationship with who they traded with, and linking those purchases to the landowner kaupapa and the benefits that they wanted to be a part of. Challenges, we thought it would be good to develop a trading strategy that guided your decisions in a way where you manage your liabilities and you maximise your opportunities. So, yeah, all of the above. The other aspect we brought in right at the end was this concept of a model forest, where forests are valued for their social, economic, environmental and cultural benefits and trade-offs, and that they're considered equally. We'll have links to some of these references that you can follow up with. But our research, our decision makers that participate in the research, actually we wanted to look at what would a native forestry model look like. What would the key elements be that strengthen it? Because there are a lot of both production forestry companies, certainly iwi forestry interests, wanting to do this better. How do we establish native forestry on our whenua? It's not its own industry yet, so there's a lot against it, but there are inroads into coming up with a managed model, you could say. And that's us for now.
Pia Pohatu there, and we will continue our conversation with Pia. If you have if you have any questions for Pia to answer, kia mautonu mai, we will have a session facilitated by Manu Keri very, very soon.